Hey, what is going on, guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my opinion on the best top laners for patch 6.10. So first up is going to be AD on hit tank Fizz. So if you guys remember back to last season, I think it was, AD Fizz top was like one of the most OP and one of the most picked top lane champions, and it's slowly making its way back into the meta now. You don't build the Trinity Force like you used to on top lane Fizz. You go for the Iceborne Gauntlet Sunfire Rush most of the time, but this pick right now is pretty strong in the top lane because Fizz does have a lot of good matchups right now against the meta top lane picks. And he can also run Ignite Teleport, which just allows him to get a nice snowball going in the early game. If you can get ahead with Fizz in the early game, you can look to roam, and you can just look to keep killing the enemy laner over and over again because you do have really good all-in at level 6 with Fizz. He's kind of like an Echo 2.0. He's got really good sticking power once he does get the Iceborne Gauntlet. He's also super hard to kill because of his E. Once you do get 40% CDR on Fizz, then your E's on like a 4 or 5 second cooldown, so it's just so hard to kill him in a team fight. A few cons to Fizz are that he's pretty weak if he does fall behind, since he doesn't provide that nice AoE CC ability in a team fight. You need to get ahead with Fizz, and you just need to start roaming and team fighting right away, because if you do fall behind, then you're not going to be as strong as some of the other top lane picks. And he also does not have any hard CC in his kit. Next up, I have Sion. So Sion is a really good tank champion. You don't even need to build any damage on Sion, and because of the high base damage on his abilities, he can still deal a ton in the laning phase and in team fights. He's got one of the strongest crowd control kits as well. His ultimate, his E, and his Q all provide really strong CC. His shield also just scales really well into the late game. The more health you get on Sion, the beefier your shield is going to be, and the more it's going to shield you for. So overall, Sion is one of the better scaling top lane champions. He also is a great roaming pick, and this is why I really do like Sion for top lane. Whenever you get 6 as Sion, look mid lane, look bot lane. If you see an opportunity to use your ultimate in one of those lanes, then definitely look to do so, because you can snowball your lanes out of control if you can get some good roams off with Sion. And a few cons to him are that he is a fairly easy gank pre-6 since he does not have a gap closer, and his ultimate can be hard to land if you are new to Sion. Next up is going to be Maokai. So right now I think Maokai is in a pretty good spot. We are still seeing a lot of immobile AD carries being played right now. Jinx did get that buff to her Q this patch, and therefore she is now one of the most picked and the most successful AD carries in the game. So if the enemy team does lock like a immobile AD carry, someone like a Twitch, a Misfortune, or a Jinx, then Maokai is a great pick against them since he does have that targeted route with his W. So in a team fight, if he does have flash up, he can easily look to just jump onto the enemy AD carry, root them, knock them back into his team, and they're pretty much dead from there on because his root, I think it's 2 seconds. He does have the knockback with his Q, which also slows, so he's just got really good crowd control in his kit. His ultimate is really good too because it does give his team 20% damage reduction if they are standing in it, and he's a pretty strong pick at all stages of the game. One con to Maokai is that he can get kitted pretty easily after he does use his W. He's also a pretty easy gank in the early game since he does not have a dash or a blink, so if you are going up against Maokai and he's pushing out in lane, then look to gank him in the early game to shut him down. Next up, I have Echo. In my opinion, Echo is going to stay a very strong pick in the top lane for the coming patches, unless he does get a nerf to the base damage on either his Q or his E. He's just such a low risk, high reward champion because you can build full tank on Echo and you can still deal so much damage in the early to mid game. And also, once you do get to mid game team fights, you can just dive in with Echo. If the engage looks good, then you can just keep going and keep sticking onto the opponent. If the engage doesn't look good, then you've got your ultimate, which you can use to back out and just reset the fight. So overall, he's just a very low risk, high reward champion. He does have a lot of crowd control in his kit with his Q, his W. Then once he does get the Iceborne Gauntlet, he's also going to get the slow from that. So overall, he's just got a very strong CC kit. he does have the gap closer on his E, which just allows him to dive on that back line really nicely. His sticking power is also really good because whenever once he does get the Iceborne Gauntlet and he uses the E on a target, it's going to proc the slow of the gauntlet right away. And then after that, you can use your Q, which will also slow. So once Echo does jump on you in a team fight, you're pretty much not going to get away after that. He's a pretty good split pushing champion too because he does have the wave clear with his Q, and he also will have the Sunfire cape. One con to Echo is that his W can be hard to hit at times since you do have to predict where the enemies are moving in order to be able to hit it consistently. And lastly, on my top 5 for this patch, I have Swain. So Swain has gotten a buff to every single one of his abilities these last few patches. Even his passive did get a buff in 6.9. So Swain is just a great pick right now because he's got one of the best early to mid games for any top lane champion. The matchups he does have in the top lane right now are highly in his favor because a lot of the meta picks are melee, and Swain just does a really good job in those matchups because he does have his Q, which he can place down wherever he wants now, and that just allows him to zone the enemies from CS in the laning phase. It's also a great zoning tool in team fights as well. He's an AP bruiser champion, so when I do play Swain, I usually go Rod of Ages and Zhonya's, and then after that, his build path is so versatile because if your team is lacking tankiness, then you could just go full tank after that, and you can soak a lot of damage in team fights. If you are lacking damage, then you could go for like a Rylai's into Leandry. So I just really like that Swain's build path is so versatile, and it really just does depend on your team comp and on the game as to what build you're gonna want to go. He's also super hard to kill once you do get to mid to late game team fights, since his ultimate will be healing him. Once he does get low on HP, he can pop Zhonya's, and he's going to be healing for even more in the Zhonya's, so he's just such an annoying champion to deal with once it does get to mid to late game. A few cons to Swain are that his W can be hard to hit at first since you do have to predict where the enemies are moving since it does have a bit of a delay on it, and he does not have a gap closer either, so the way you can shut Swain down is by just trying to camp him in the early game if he is pushing out. If you don't end up getting a kill on Swain in the early game and he just free farms and gets his items, then he's going to be really strong in those mid game team fights, and he's probably just going to end up solo carrying the game. So first on the honorable mentions is going to be Pantheon. Pantheon is a great early to mid game champion. You really need to have a good early game on him to be successful because if you can get a few kills, you can snowball really hard. You can help your lanes out as well because you do have your ultimate. So whenever you do hit 6 as Pantheon, look to use your ult either mid or bot lane because as long as you can get a good early game going with Pantheon, then you can carry a game really hard. Next up, I have Aurelia. So Aurelia does have a little bit of a weaker early game. Her levels 1 to 3 aren't the best, but where Aurelia shines is once she does get her Sheen and once she does get her Trinity Force, you want to try to go for an all-in on your opponent once you do get your Sheen. For example, if you do finish that item off and the enemy doesn't even have an item built yet, then the chances are you will be able to 1v1 them as long as you do have your ultimate and as long as you can get that stun off. So as long as you can have a good early to mid game as Aurelia and you can just end up out dueling your opponent, you can carry with her pretty hard. Next up, I have Kale. In my opinion, Kale is a very underrated pick right now for top lane. She does have a lot of favorable matchups and she is a ranged champion, or she does have the range form on her E. She's a melee pick whenever her E is on cooldown, but she can bully out a lot of the meta top laners right now and she can farm really easily in the laning phase. Once you do get to mid to late game as Kale, you do a lot of damage and you are also a pretty good pick against Zed. If the enemy team does end up getting Zed somehow, then I would definitely recommend trying out Kale for top lane since her ultimate does a really good job at countering Zed's ult. Next up, I have Yasuo. Yasuo is a pretty good pick right now for top lane. There aren't a lot of champions right now in the top lane that can really bully him out in the laning phase or that can do really well against him. So Yasuo can just farm up in the laning phase. When he does get really strong is once he does get his core build and once you get to mid to late game team fights. So as long as you can play him correctly and you can hit your knockup in team fights, then you can definitely carry really hard on Yasuo. Next up, I have Trundle. So Trundle is going to stay a pretty good pick in the top lane as long as we do keep seeing the tanks being played. He's a great pick if the enemy team does lock a Sion or an Echo or Maokai, because once you do get to those mid to late game team fights, you're going to be able to use your ult on them. You're going to gain a lot of bonus armor and magic resist, so you're going to be super hard to kill in those team fights, and you're also still going to deal quite a bit of damage, because I would recommend going 1 or 2 damage items on Trundle. So overall, pick him if the enemy team does have a tank. And to round out the honorable mentions for this patch, I have Wukong. So Wukong is one of the better early to mid game champions. He does actually have a pretty strong all-in in the laning phase. If you are confident on your Wukong, you can run Ignite on him and you can look to get first blood in the laning phase, because he is one of the hardest snowballing top lane champions. Once you do get ahead as Wukong, you can just keep killing your opponent over and over again, and your team fight is also really strong on him. Your ultimate is just such a game-changing ability. If you can hit that on multiple targets, it does start to deal a lot of damage too once you get level 11 and once you get rank 2 in your ultimate. So overall, Wukong is a pretty strong pick right now for top. So that is going to be it for the video, guys. If you did enjoy, then please be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you have not already. So thanks for watching, guys. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.